"If you don't get in the car with me, I am going to hurt you." Those were the words Stephen Robert Sablon spoke as he forced his 13-year-old victim into the car. 2 days later, 2 words, "Help me," saved her from her nightmare. Sablon was arrested and charged to court, where he faces life in prison if convicted. While the outcome of Sablon's case is yet to be known, here are 11 kidnappers who got what they deserved in court. Chowchilla kidnappers. The infamous Chowchilla abductors made headlines in 1976 for kidnapping a school bus with 26 children and the driver, Edward Ray. 2 brothers, James and Richard Schoenfield, and a friend, Frederick Woods, decided to make themselves rich by committing the perfect crime. The trio had mused over the possibility of such a crime, and such thought could have easily passed for mindless ramblings of teenagers inspired by crime thrillers. The weight of parental expectations bore down on them as they entered into their early 20s. Coming from a wealthy home, James, Fred, and Rick felt they had disappointed their parents, and together they decided to make themselves rich. The plan was simple: kidnap school children, request a ransom of $5 million, and then release the children unharmed once the ransom was paid. On the day of the crime, the would-be kidnappers were all set up on a lonely road in Chowchilla, where they pretended their car had broken down. The unsuspecting school bus driver, Ed Ray, stopped to investigate what was going on, but as soon as he opened the door, he knew he was in trouble. One of the 3 men forced his way into the bus armed with a shotgun and immediately took over the wheels, while a second man watched the driver and school children. The third accomplice followed behind in a different car. The kidnappers ditched the school bus and continued their journey with 2 vans driving over 100 miles from Chowchilla to Livermore. At Livermore, the victims were again moved into another van hidden in the dirt. The kidnappers hoped to keep them here until the ransom was paid, but once they had gone, the driver, Ed Ray, and some older kids dug their way out using whatever they could find around them. Once out, they got to a nearby rock quarry where some workers identified them. In about 36 hours after they were kidnapped, the victims and their families were once again united. When the kidnappers learned that their hostages had escaped, all hell broke loose. James and Frederick decided to make a run for it, so they headed north toward Canada, while Richard, out of fear, or perhaps guilt, decided to confess what he had done to his parents. It didn't take the police too long to connect the 3 men to the crime. First, the van they used in hiding the hostages belonged to Frederick, and then the van was buried in a rock quarry owned by Frederick's father. It turns out their perfect crime was not so perfect after all. With this evidence, Frederick became a suspect in the investigation, and when the police realized that he and James were missing, all 3 men became the focus of the investigation. Once again, Richard was the first to turn himself into the police, confessing to his crime. Later, James and Frederick were both arrested. All 3 men were charged to court on August 4th, where they pleaded innocent to 40 counts of felony. The case was delayed until July 25, 1977, when all 3 suspects pleaded guilty to 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom, with the prosecutor arguing that they had inflicted psychological harm on their victims. James, Richard, and Frederick were all sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the conviction was later changed to life in prison with the possibility of parole after an appeal court ruled that no physical harm was inflicted on the victims. Ariel Castro. One of the most notorious kidnappers in the history of America, Ariel Castro shocked the world when it was discovered that he had kidnapped and held 3 women in captivity for over 10 years. Castro worked as a school bus driver for over 22 years until he was fired for several infractions. Unknown to the school and parents of these children, Castro hid a dark secret. He was not only a kidnapper, but also a sex addict. The fact that Castro could go on for so long without being caught shows that evil wears many shades. He kidnapped his first victim, Michelle Knight, on the 23rd of August, 2002. Michelle, then 21 years old, was a mother in distress on the day she went missing. Her son, then 2 years old, had been put in foster care after her mother's boyfriend got drunk and fractured the boy's knees. Having lost custody of her son, Michelle was on her way to a case management meeting when she got lost, so she didn't think twice when a stranger offered her a ride. Unknown to her, she would never make it to the meeting or even get to see her son again. Recounting her experience, Michelle revealed that the first thing her captor did was rip the only picture of her son to pieces right in front of her as he said to her, "You will never see him again." 7 months later, Castro brought in a second victim, Amanda Berry. Amanda had closed from work and was returning home when she was offered a ride by Castro. She was about to turn 17 the next day, but never got to celebrate her birthday. The police assumed Amanda was a runaway, but her mom insisted she wouldn't run away a day before her birthday. A week after going missing, Amanda's mom received a call. The voice on the other end said, "I have Amanda. She's fine and will be coming home in a couple of days." That was a cruel lie because Amanda's mom died without without knowing where her daughter was or what had become of her. A third victim, 14-year-old Gina DeJesus, later joined Amanda and Michelle. Gina was walking home from school when she was kidnapped. As with the other two women, Castro offered Gina a ride home, which she accepted because she was friends with his daughter. For the next 10 years, all three women remained locked up in Castro's house, while Castro joined in on the search for the women and even attended public vigils held by their parents. While leaving the house one day, Castro left one of the doors unlocked. Amanda seized the opportunity and screamed for help until a neighbor, Charles Ramsey, heard her, and together with another neighbor, they rescued Amanda, who had a 6-year-old daughter by then. The police arrived shortly and found Gina and Michelle in the house. All three women were sent to the hospital, and Castro was arrested. A grand jury indicted him on 329 counts, including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder. Although Castro pleaded not guilty, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years, which is fair considering the gravity of his crimes. Unable to take what he dished out, Castro committed suicide in prison by hanging himself with his bedsheet. In contrast, his victims have slowly adjusted to normal life. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. The bizarre case of Elizabeth Smart, the victim of Brain Mitchell, and his wife Wanda Barzee, is among the most famous cases of Stockholm Syndrome. Mitchell and Barzee were religious fanatics with a history of drugs and child abuse, which was not officially confirmed. Other than their fanaticism, the couple had other things in common. For instance, they were both monsters. On hearing their story and what they did to their victim, most people will stop to wonder how they found each other. Call it coincidence or fate, but one thing is certain: this was a match made in hell. Mitchell had been married twice and fathered several children. He was accused of molesting his 3-year-old son and stepdaughter from his second marriage. These accusations were never confirmed. Meanwhile, Barzee was also divorced and had 6 children. Her relationship with her children was strained because, according to one of her daughters, Barzee was a monster. Due to their extreme beliefs, the couple broke away from the Latter-day Saints Church. Mitchell went by the name Emmanuel, grew a beard, and wore white tunics to depict the prophet, while his wife Barzee went by the name Hephzibah. When and how Elizabeth came into the picture remains unknown, but on the morning of June 5, 2002, Mitchell broke into Elizabeth's home and kidnapped her. Elizabeth and her family had gone to sleep the previous day after a successful end-of-year awards ceremony where the then 14-year-old won several awards. Elizabeth remembers waking up to the sound of footsteps in her room to see a man standing beside her with a knife to her throat. He then whispered to her, "I have a knife to your neck. Don't make a sound. Get out of bed and come with me or I will kill you and your family." Elizabeth obeyed and followed the man, who led her deep into the woods where she met a woman. On getting there, the woman, Barzee, began to prepare Elizabeth for a ritual, after which Mitchell proclaimed Elizabeth to be his wife and then raped her. For the next 9 months, Elizabeth's world would be completely turned inside out. She was tied to a tree and raped repeatedly by Mitchell. She was also forced to drink alcohol, take drugs, and starve for days. The twist in this story is that, unlike most other victims of a kidnapping, Elizabeth had opportunities to ask for help. Her abductors took her to the grocery store, restaurant, and even a party where they were photographed. Each time she went out, Elizabeth was disguised with a wig, veil, or hairscarf. This, perhaps, is what makes her father believe that she had been brainwashed by Mitchell. Luckily for Elizabeth, her younger sister Mary, who was also in the room when she was kidnapped, recalled hearing the voice of the man who spoke that night. The man had been hired to work in their house, and he was called Emmanuel. The police quickly discovered Emmanuel was Brian Mitchell, and on March 12, 2003, Mitchell and Barzee were arrested after a couple recognized Mitchell from the photos on the news. Mitchell and Barzee were both charged to court, but the case dragged on for 8 years because Mitchell was deemed unfit to stand trial and required a competency evaluation. His legal team argued that although he was accountable for his crimes, he was legally insane and should be found not guilty. However, the defense argument was ruled out, and the jury found Mitchell guilty and sentenced him to life in prison, while Barzee got 2 concurrent 15-year sentences. Barry Keenan. Keenan started well in life and then fell to rock bottom after an accident left him addicted to painkillers. At the same time, his father suffered financial setbacks, and his mother attempted to commit suicide. Keenan knew money was all he needed to solve his problems, but his addiction and losing his job as the youngest member of the LA Stock Exchange drove him into despair. Keenan needed a quick fix for his money problems, so he turned to kidnapping. When choosing his victim, Keenan decided the brother of a former classmate was the perfect candidate. Keenan set his sights on the son of Frank Sinatra Sr., a popular actor and singer. According to Keelan, "I decided upon Jr. because Frank Sr. was tough, and I had friends whose parents were in show business, and I knew Frank always got his way," Keenan told the New Times Los Angeles in 1998. It wouldn't be morally wrong to put him through a few hours of grief worrying about his son. His rationalization was both simplistic and clearly the product of a deluded mind. He saw it as a business deal. First, he would kidnap Frank Jr. and force Frank Sr. to pay a ransom. Then he would invest the ransom money that was paid, make some profit, profits and then pay back the initial ransom amount to Frank Sr. After making up his mind, Keenan recruited the services of his best friend, Joe Amsler, and his mother's ex-boyfriend, John Irwin, who would later be the weak link in Keenan's plan and the reason why it all went up in smoke. On December 8, 1963, after 2 failed attempts, Keenan and his friend finally kidnapped Frank Jr. from his room in Harrah's Hotel by posing as waiters. The 2 friends entered the room to meet a shocked Frank Jr. and a friend eating. Keenan then gagged Frank Jr. at gunpoint to stop him from calling out for help while his friend was tied up. Once they got Frank Jr., the kidnappers drove down to their base in L.A. The third accomplice, John Irwin, called Frank Sr., demanding a ransom of $240,000 delivered by an FBI agent at the location provided by the kidnappers. So far, the plan had gone smoothly, but then Irwin panicked. Keenan and Amsler were on their way to pick up the ransom at the delivery point when Irwin panicked and let Frank Jr. go. After walking for a while, the 19-year-old abductee met a security guard at Bel Air who took him to his sister's house. The police were informed, but Frank Jr. could not provide a good description of the men who had kidnapped him because he was blindfolded. But Keenan and his gang were out on their luck. The investigators had tracked down the house where Frank Jr. was held and released information on the kidnappers to the press. The kidnappers must have felt cornered, and Irwin, who has proven to be the weakest link among the 3 men time after time, was again the first to confess to the crime. He revealed everything he had done to his brother, who quickly called the FBI office in San Diego to report. The FBI moved speedily and arrested all 3 men, recovering most of the ransom money. In court, the case made headlines partly due to the personalities involved and the defense argument. According to Keenan, Frank Jr. was behind the kidnapping, and he had intended to use it as a publicity stunt to boost his career, but the FBI had a piece of evidence that contradicted Keenan's testimony and proved that Frank Jr. had no hands in the kidnapping. With that, Keenan and his friend Amsler were slammed with life sentences plus 75 years, while Irwin was sentenced to 75 years in prison. Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Dubbed the crime of the century, Bruno Hauptmann was convicted of the kidnap and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of famous aviator pilot Charles Lindbergh and his wife, Anne Lindbergh. Hauptmann's trial made the front page of every newspaper. It drew the attention of thousands of spectators, reporters, celebrities, and even the notorious American gangster Al Capone, who called the kidnapping the most outrageous thing he has ever heard of. But how did Hauptmann, an illegal German immigrant and carpenter, end up as the most hated man in the world? It all started on the night of March 1, 1932, when Charles was kidnapped from his nursery at Lindbergh's Hopewell residence in New Jersey. The missing child was reported by his nurse Betty Gow at about 10 p.m. on the same day, and a quick investigation of the premises revealed a ransom note demanding $50,000, a broken ladder, and 2 sets of footprints. America woke up the next day to the news of Charles Jr.'s kidnapping, and the once peaceful home of the Lindberghs was surrounded by curious onlookers, as well as reporters looking to land a big scoop. As for the Lindberghs, Charles had decided he wanted to communicate with the kidnappers and instructed the police that no arrest should be made until the ransom was paid and the baby safely returned. The Lindbergh also made their intention known to the kidnappers through a radio broadcast. On March 6th, 5 days after Charles Jr. was kidnapped, another ransom note was sent to Charles Sr. This time, the kidnapper was requesting $70,000. The kidnapper also warned the Lindberghs not to get the police involved, assuring them that the baby was fine, and Dr. John Condon, a retired school principal, volunteered to act as an intermediary between the kidnapper and the Lindberghs. Dr. Condon met with the kidnapper twice, who identified himself as John. Both times they met at 2 different cemeteries. On the second meeting, Condon handed John $50,000 in gold notes, and John gave Condon a note with directions to a boat called Nellie, but it was a wild goose chase. There was no boat. In fact, Charles Jr. had been dead a long time. His body was accidentally discovered by a truck driver who had stopped to relieve himself by the roadside. The cause of death was a blow to the head, and it was assumed that this happened when the kidnapper had tried to descend the ladder holding the baby. The ladder had broken in half, at which point both the kidnapper and baby must have fallen. With the baby dead and the ransom paid, investigators turned their attention to the marked note that had been used in paying the ransom. On September 1934, a bank teller alerted the authorities after receiving a $10 marked note. On the note was a car's license plate number belonging to a man named Hauptmann. The investigators placed Hauptmann on surveillance, and when he noticed he was being watched, Hauptmann attempted to escape but was apprehended. About $13,000 in marked notes were found hidden in Hauptmann's garage. According to him, a friend named Isidore Fish, who Hauptmann claimed died of tuberculosis. Investigators also found Dr. Condon's phone number written on a door in Hauptmann's house, and handwriting analysis confirmed that Hauptmann had written the ransom notes. His trial lasted about 5 weeks, and the defense argued that the evidence against Hauptmann was circumstantial. However, the jury returned a guilty verdict. He was to be executed suspended, and despite attempts to appeal the verdict, Bruno Hauptmann was electrocuted on April 3, 1936, and up till the end, he never confessed to the kidnapping. Angelo LaMarca. Famously known as the Weinberger kidnapping, the kidnap and murder of one-month-old Peter Weinberger was remarkably identical to that of Charles Jr. The only difference was that Peter was from an average American home, unlike Charles Jr. Because of this, the Weinberger kidnapping became quite famous. It was painfully clear that even an average Joe could be targeted by kidnappers. Unfortunately, the Weinbergers learned this the hard way after their son was kidnapped from the patio of their suburban home where Betty had left him to sleep. She had left the baby alone for about 10 minutes, and by the time she returned, the baby was gone, and in its place was a note. On seeing the note, Betty and her husband Morris decided the right thing to do was to inform the police that their son had been kidnapped. They also decided the right thing to do was to pay the ransom as soon as possible, but the Weinbergers were an average American family and did not have $2,000 just lying around. So they solicited friends and family and raised the money to pay for Peter's safe return. With the help of the police and the bank, the Weinbergers were able to secure the cash, although it was a national holiday. So far, everything had gone well, except for one slight error. The media had caught a whiff of the news, and like dogs on a scent, they were itching to publish. However, the police had earlier instructed that news of the kidnapping should not be published for 24 hours to ensure Peter's safe return. Despite this warning, the news of the abduction was splashed on the front page of the New York Daily News. Every detail, including where the kidnapper had requested the drop-off to be made, was known to the public, and the next day, reporters and onlookers gathered at the drop-off. Of course, the kidnapper never showed up. The kidnapper would contact the Weinbergers twice, and both times never showed up to collect the ransom. 7 days after the kidnapping, the FBI stepped into the investigation and immediately started to analyze the handwriting on the ransom notes left by the kidnapper. These were the only pieces of evidence available to the authorities, and to find the right match, the FBI had to compare the handwriting on the ransom note to documents from New York State Motor Vehicle Bureau, federal and state probation offices, schools, aircraft plants, and various municipalities. 6 weeks and 2 million documents later, a match was found. The document was a record of the arrest of one Angelo LaMarca for bootlegging. When confronted, LaMarca denied being involved with the kidnapping but eventually caved in when presented with the handwriting analysis. What LaMarca revealed next shocked everyone. He revealed that he had come to the drop site a day after the kidnapping as promised, but met several reporters and the police. Scared, he decided to abandon the baby by the roadside. On searching the location provided by LaMarca, investigators found remains of a baby, which turned out to be Peter Weinberger. LaMarca was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder, and he pleaded not guilty, backing his plea up with the insanity defense. Testifying in his own trial, LaMarca mentioned that being in so much debt had made him temporarily insane and that he acted alone. 2 psychiatrists were brought in to help with the case. Dr. Cusacks, who spoke for the defense, claimed that LaMarca was not in the right state of mind while committing the crime. But the prosecution's psychiatrist argued that LaMarca had used paper clips when leaving ransom notes to avoid leaving any fingerprints behind. This wasn't the work of an insane man. On December 7, 1956, the jury reached a verdict. LaMarca was found guilty and sentenced to death. Despite his appeals and intervention by his wife and a few members of the public, LaMarca's sentence was carried out at 11 p.m. on August 7, 1958. Carl Hall and Bonnie Hetty. Hall and Hetty were Missouri's version of Michelle and Barzy, except in this case, both Hall and Hetty were neither religious nor fanatics, but spoilt, addicted brats. Carl was the son of a wealthy lawyer who squandered his inheritance on drugs and booze, got arrested for robbery, and was sent to prison. Hetty was also living off her inheritance. She partied hard, and occasionally she would prostitute herself. Carl and Hetty were both once married and later divorced before they hooked up together after Carl was released from prison. While in prison, Hall had hatched the perfect plan to set him up for life, and Hetty was a perfect criminal partner. Hall told Hardy his plan. His target was a wealthy car dealer, Robert Greenlease Sr. Hall had initially planned to kidnap Greenlease's 11-year-old daughter, but decided that the 6-year-old son, Bobby, would be an easier target, and on September 23, 1953, the plan was set in motion. Hetty introduced herself as Bobby's aunt to Sister Morand, who was a nun at the Notre Dame de Sion preschool, where Robert Greenlease Jr., aka Bobby, attended. According to her, Bobby's mother had suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized, so she would be taking Bobby home. Sister Morand informed Bobby that his aunt would be taking him home as she led Bobby to Hetty. On seeing the Hetty, Bobby was calm and didn't show any indication that would have suggested he did not know who the woman was. Sister Morand observed the two of them walk away and, in her account, said that the Hetty had her arms around Bobby and even held his hand as they entered into a taxi. A few hours later, the school reached out to the Greenleases' residence to inquire about Mrs. Greenlease's health. Surprisingly, it was Mrs. Greenlease herself who received the call. At that point, the veil was off, and it became painfully clear Bobby had been kidnapped, and both the police and FBI were immediately informed. Shortly after Bobby was taken, Hall and Hetty sent a ransom note demanding $600,000 in $10 and $20 bills. They promised the Greenlease that their son Bobby would be returned within 24 hours if their demand was met. On October 5, 1953, the kidnappers called the Greenlease residents to inform them they had received the ransom and would return Bobby in 24 hours as promised. This was a very reassuring gesture for the kidnappers, but the Greenlease and the investigators didn't know that Bobby was already dead. Hall never intended to return Bobby after the ransom was paid, so after a failed attempt to strangle the boy, Hall shot him in the back of the head, and with Hetty's help, Bobby was buried and his body covered with a heap of lime. Hall and Hetty fled to St. Louis, and when Hetty was asleep, Hall left $2,000 in her purse and fled with the rest. Hall was arrested the next day, October 6th, after a cab driver he hired to be his chauffeur ousted him to the police because he was throwing around a lot of money. He gave up Hetty's location, confessed to kidnapping and killing Bobby, and also revealed where his body was buried. Hall and Hetty pled guilty on October 30th, 1953, and on November 19th, 1953, the jury delivered the death sentence after deliberating for about 1 hour and 8 minutes. 15 minutes later, the judge signed off the sentence, and on December 18th, 1953, Hall and Hetty were executed in a lethal gas chamber. According to Judge Reeves, who delivered the sentence, "I think the verdict fits the evidence. It is the most cold-blooded, brutal murder I have ever tried." Cameron Hooker. Hooker kidnapped and tortured 2 women, Marlise Spanhake and Colleen Stan. Spanhake was killed, and Colleen spent several years as a sex slave before escaping. However, there was a third woman who was both a victim and an accomplice. Her name is Janice. Before meeting Hooker, Janice was already a victim of abuse by her family. So at the age of 15, when she met Hooker, who worked at a local lumber mill, Janice was already primed and an easy target. She was often abused by Hooker, who also introduced her to BDSM. Hooker married Janice in 1975, 3 years after they first met. By now, he trusted Janice enough to reveal his plans of having a sex slave, and Janice was more than willing to go along with the plan because that meant someone else would take her place as Hooker's sex object. The only exception was that Hooker wouldn't have intercourse with his sex slave. On January 31st, 1976, Hooker offered Spanhake a ride. On getting to her destination, Spanhake was about to leave the car when Hooker pulled her back inside and fastened a specially made box over her head to prevent her from moving before driving her home. Hooker suspended Spanhake from the ceiling in the basement of their home while his wife tried to calm her down. But Spanhake was hysterical and wouldn't stop screaming, so Hooker decided to cut off her vocal cords. Although she could not speak, Spanhake motioned to Hooker to give her a pen and unfastened her hand. She then wrote on the piece of paper, "I will give you anything you want if you let me go." But according to Janice, Hooker never planned on letting her go, so he shot her twice in the abdomen with a pellet gun before strangling her to death. On May 19th, 1977, Hooker and his wife Janice kidnapped their second victim, 20-year-old Colleen Stan. Colleen was attending a friend's birthday in Northern California when she accepted a ride from the Hookers. Although she had turned down offers from 2 other strangers, Colleen decided to go with the Hookers because Janice was sitting in the front seat and she had a baby. It is easy to see how this must have made her feel safe. Unfortunately, it was a decision she would live to regret. Hooker threatened her with a knife before blindfolding and gauging her. Colleen was strung up like Spanhake at home, tortured, starved, and made to sleep in a wooden box slightly bigger than a coffin. Over a period of 7 years, this became Colleen's new reality. At some point, Hooker made her sign a slave contract, giving him right over her body. To prevent her from escaping, Hooker then lies that he belonged to a secret organization, the Company, and if Colleen tried to escape, the organization would retaliate immediately. From that moment, Hooker began to rape Colleen, which made Janice jealous. She decided to retaliate by also sleeping with random strangers. With Janice's help, Colleen found the courage to run away from Hooker, who had given her the freedom to get a job. This was after Janice had told her that the company didn't exist and even encouraged her to run away. Colleen called Hooker to tell him that she wouldn't return home, but she didn't go to the police because of her agreement with Janice to give Hooker a chance to reform. 3 months later, Janice reported her husband to the police, and that was when the authorities got to know what actually happened to Spanhake. Hooker was charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, rape, and other sex offenses. Both Colleen and Janice testified against Hooker in the trial. Hooker also took the stand to testify on his behalf. According to him, Colleen had consented to all their sexual acts. He also mentioned that Colleen wasn't coerced to stay with them and could have left at any time if she wanted. Despite his testimony and the fact that a psychiatrist corroborated it, the jury found Hooker guilty and sentenced him to a total of 104 years in prison. Philip and Nancy Garrido. The Garridos preyed on young girls and even went as far as recording it. The couple kidnapped 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard and held her for 18 years during this time. Philip repeatedly raped Dugard, and eventually she conceived and gave birth to 2 children. Dugard gave birth to her first daughter at the age of 14 years, while the second daughter was born at the age of 17 years. All through her captivity, Dugard and her daughters remained locked indoors playing a sick game of house where she and her daughters pretended to be Philip's daughters and called Nancy Mom. But what's even more appalling is that despite Philip's record as a child offender, the authorities were negligent by not following up with Philip's parole. This wasn't Philip's first rodeo as he scouted the street for his victim. At the time, Dugard was climbing up the hill leading away from her house to catch the school bus. A car approached behind her, and as the driver rolled down the window, Dugard thought he was about to ask for directions. But the next time she woke up, she was 120 miles away from home, handcuffed in a shed that was bolted shut. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, and some of her classmates witnessed the kidnapping, and Probin tried chasing the kidnappers on a bicycle but couldn't get to them. Dugard's abduction captured the nation's attention. A search party was formed, flyers and posters were sent out, and the town was covered in pink ribbons because pink was her favorite color. Rewards were offered, and Dugard's story was even featured on the national TV program, America's Most Wanted. Dugard spent the first few weeks in captivity handcuffed, and the only person she came in contact with was Philip, who raped her on the very first day she was abducted. After some time, Philip moved Dugard to a bigger room and handcuffed her to the bed. They spent a lot of time together. Philip would binge drugs, rant about how demon angels had led him to kidnap Dugard so she could help with his sexual problems, profess to be a man of God, or request sexual favors from Dugard. 7 months later, he introduced her to his wife Nancy, whom Dugard describes as evil and twisted. According to Dugard, Nancy was just as manipulative as Philip, as she sometimes showed concern for her situation, and at other times she was cold, cruel, and jealous. After she got pregnant, Dugard still wasn't allowed to see a doctor, so she learned all about sex, pregnancy, and how to care for her children from the TV that was provided. However, she wasn't allowed to watch the news. On August 24, 2009, Philip wanted to hold an event at the University of California, so he went to the police office to get permission. The special event manager, Lisa Campbell, noticed his erratic behavior and the submissive attitude of Dugard's children who were with Philip. She informed Philip to report back the next day, and while he was gone, the police ran a check on him. On August 26, 2009, Philip met with his parole officer who questioned Dugard and her daughters. Dugard identified herself as Alyssa and vouched for Philip, saying he was a changed man. The parole officer must have had his doubts because instead of letting them go, he called the police. When the police arrived, Philip confessed to kidnapping and raping Dugard. At the same time, Dugard also stopped pretending and confirmed what Philip had told the police. Philip and his wife Nancy were arrested, and on August 29, 2009, they pleaded not guilty to kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. The case dragged on for a while, and the Garridos maintained their innocence plea. Eventually, justice prevailed, and on April 28, 2011, they both pleaded guilty to kidnapping and rape by force. Philip, who was considered the master manipulator, was sentenced to 431 years to life imprisonment, while his wife, who they claimed was under Philip's influence, got 36 years to life imprisonment. In the end, justice prevailed, and the kidnappers got what they deserved in court. If you like this video, click the card on your screen to watch more videos like this.